Hi students, welcome to session 2 of respiration in organisms. In the previous sessions we studied about respiratory system, introduction to respiratory system and respiratory system in animals. We will study about respiratory system in humans. Now we will study about breathing and respiration. Yes students, breathing and respiration. Students, breathing is a means of maximizing the process of gaseous exchange which involves pumping movements to ventilate the respiratory surface. For example, we studied about the chest movements which can deflate and inflate the lungs in mammals and in human beings too. So this may not occur in simpler organisms, just like in amoeba or earthworm. In other words, it is a process of taking in air which is rich in oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide filled with air with the help of respiratory organs. So remember students that the taking in of air rich in oxygen into the body is called inhalation and giving out of air filled with carbon dioxide is called exhalation. So inhalation is the movement of air from the external environment through the airways and into the alveoli. And exhalation is the movement of air out of the bronchial tubes through the airways to the external environment during breathing. So basically, breathing is a continuous process which goes on all the time and throughout the life of an organism. The number of times a person breathes is in a minute is termed as the breathing rate. So during breathing, inhalation and exhalation take place alternately. A breath means one inhalation plus one exhalation. So in this way, human beings normally breathe. But as we know that there are some differences, despite of being differences between breathing and respiration, they are connected. So how they are connected? Let us see. Yes, as we inhale, the air follows the route. The air first gets in the nose of the human being. After that, it passes through the nasal cavity, where the small hairs are present to prevent the dirt and other unwanted particles into our lungs. Then it passes through larynx. Then it passes through trachea, then alveoli, bronchioles, lung, and then bronchi. Sorry, this is not the sequence. It first the air passes through nose, then nasal cavity, then larynx, then trachea, then bronchi, then lung. From there into bronchioles, and finally it reaches to alveoli. So this is the sequence which you have to remember. Nose, nasal cavity, then larynx, then trachea, then bronchi, then lungs, then bronchioles, and finally alveoli. So basically air is exchanged in the alveoli. Oxygen absorbed in the alveoli is picked up by the blood in our body. On the other hand, carbon dioxide is picked up from all the body parts and is transported by the blood to the lungs. So remember students that from the outside the lungs are pink and they are like a sponge, but the inside of the lung contains the reach down or many branches. At the bottom of the trachea or windpipe, there are two large tubes, and these tubes are called the main bronchi. One is present on the left into the left lung, while the other heads right into the right lung. So each bronchus the name for just one of the bronchi, it branches off into tubes that get smaller and even smaller, still like branches on a big tree. The tiniest tubes are called bronchioles, and there are about 30,000 of them in each lung. How amazing it is! Each bronchiole is about the same thickness as a hair. At the end of each bronchiole is a spatial area that leads into clumps of teeny tiny air sacs called alveoli. And there are about 600 million alveoli in our lungs. How amazing it is! And if we stretch them out, we would cover an entire tennis court. Now that's a load of alveoli, right? So each alveolus, what we call just one of the alveoli, has a mesh-like covering of very small blood vessels called capillaries, and these capillaries are so tiny that the cells in our blood need to line up single file just to march through them. Now just imagine that when you are walking with your dog, cleaning your room, or spiking a volleyball or a football, you probably don't think about inhaling or breathing in. But you have got other things on your mind. But every time you inhale air, dozens of body parts work together to help get that air in there without yet even thinking about it. So remember, as we breathe in, our diaphragm contracts and flattens out. It allows it to move down, so our lungs have more space to grow larger as they fill up with the air. And the diaphragm isn't the only part that gives our lungs the space they need, but even our rib muscles also lift the ribs up and outward to give the lungs more space. At the same time, when we inhale air through our mouth and nose, and the air heads down the trachea or windpipe, on the way down the windpipe, tiny hairs do movement to keep mucus out of our lungs. The air then goes through the series of branches in our lungs through the bronchi and the bronchioles. So bronchioles are basically the branches coming out or extending out of the bronchi. The air finally ends up in 600 million alveoli. As these millions of alveoli fill up with air, the lungs get bigger. Remember that we can really feel the power of the lungs. It's the alveoli that allows oxygen from the air to pass into our blood. All the cells in the body need oxygen every minute of the day. Oxygen passes through the walls of each alveolus into the tiny capillaries that surround it. So the oxygen enters the blood into the tiny capillaries, hitching a ride on the red blood cells and traveling through layers of blood vessels to the heart. So basically the heart then sends the oxygenated blood out to all the cells in the body. So this is how it works. But what about exhalation? When it's time to exhale or breathe out, everything happens in reverse. The diaphragm, it relaxes, it moves up, pushing the air out of the lungs. Our rib muscles become relaxed, and our ribs move in again, creating a smaller space in our chest. By now our cells have used the oxygen they need, and our blood is carrying carbon dioxide and other wastes that must leave our body because that is toxic to our body. So the blood comes back through the capillaries and the wastes enter the alveoli. Then we breathe them out in the reverse order of how they came in. The air goes through the bronchioles, out the bronchi, out the trachea, and finally out through our mouth and nose. The air that we breathe out not only contains wastes and carbon dioxide, but it's warning now. As as air travels through our body, it picks up the heat along the way. We can feel this heat by putting our hand in front of our mouth or nose as we breathe out. It is the warm air. It is the heat. So, with all this movement, we might be wondering that why things don't get stuck as the lungs fill and empty. Luckily, our lungs are covered by two really spatial layers and membranes, and these membranes are separated by a fluid that allows them to slide around easily when we inhale and exhale. So this is how it works. So basically here you can see the beautiful diagram which shows the red blood cells, and here you can see some arrows coming in. This means that oxygen is coming in and carbon dioxide is going out. So basically this oxygen, when it enters in, it reaches to all the red blood cells. Not only the red blood cells, but all the blood cells. And then other cells, they expel out carbon dioxide. So these are the red blood cells. Here you can see red color blood cells. So only a very thin membrane separates the air. This is the thin membrane which separates the air in the alveolus. Let me write it down for you. There is only a very thin membrane which separates the air in the alveolus from the blood in the capillaries. So remember that oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out. Now here, this red blood cell seems to be very small, but it actually performs very important function. So basically, when we exhale, the carbon dioxide rich air follows the reverse route, finally moving out through the nose, and this is the process of breathing. So let us see what actually happens in the alveolus. Yes. Here you can see the beautiful diagram of two lungs, and these are its branches. Here you can see the red one, which is called as something like pulmonary vein, right? This blue one is the pulmonary artery, right? So basically, these red blood cells play a very important role in the passing out of air in pulmonary vein and pulmonary artery. Basically, what we studied, that oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out, while the air enters this trachea, this windpipe or the trachea, after passing through the nose and the larynx, and then it carries the air to the bronchus. The air then moves into the bronchioles and then into the alveoli. Here you can see many branches of alveoli. So basically, the pulmonary artery, it brings deoxygenated blood from the heart, and the exchange of gases takes place at the alveoli, while the pulmonary vein returns oxygenated blood to the heart. So here what you can see, these branches, these are all bronchioles, right? Then this is trachea or the windpipe. Here you can see some of the rings. So these all rings are the rings of cartilage. This is trachea, this is right bronchus. Here you can see some more branches which are called alveoli. Here you can see more clearer picture of this alveoli, right? So the air enters the trachea after passing the nose and larynx, and then it carries the air to the bronchus. Then the air moves into the bronchioles, means the bronchus branches, and then into the alveoli. Finally, the pulmonary artery brings deoxygenated blood from the heart. An exchange of gases takes place at the alveoli, while the pulmonary vein returns oxygenated blood to the heart. So basically, the oxygen absorbed in the alveoli while breathing combines with hemoglobin, which is present in the blood. So this is the red pigment which is present in the blood, which gives the blood cells its color. That is why the blood cells are termed as red blood cells. So the oxygen absorbed in the alveoli while breathing combines with hemoglobin in the blood, and this is carried as oxyhemoglobin because oxygen and hemoglobin gets combined. So this is carried as oxyhemoglobin to all the parts or cells of the body, and in these cells oxygen helps to break down food or glucose or sugar to release energy. So there is a chemical reaction which is involved in this breakdown of sugar, and that is this: sugar plus oxygen gives energy plus carbon dioxide plus water. So this is the chemical reaction which is involved in the breakdown of sugar. Sugar, with the help of oxygen, gives out energy plus carbon dioxide plus water. So this is the process of respiration. Along with energy, carbon dioxide and water is also released during respiration, right? So energy is in the form of heat, and remember this chemical reaction which takes place during the process of respiration, right? So that was all about the respiratory system in humans and breathing and respiration process, which are interconnected with each other but having many differences. I hope you liked today's session. We will meet in the next session with a new topic, that is the respiratory system in plants. So till then, keep learning, keep enjoying, and have a nice time.